La-Mulana is a game considered by some to be a cult classic. I say considered by some because describing this game simply as niche doesn't really do it justice. It's a 2D puzzle platformer where you take on the role of Lemeza Kusogi, a Japanese-American archaeologist exploring ancient ruins said to be the cradle of civilization. While it superficially pays homage to adventure movies like Indiana Jones, mechanically it is the video game equivalent of the paperwork scene from Hot Fuzz. And by that I mean you're going to be spending a lot of time taking notes because these games are actually about the archaeology. The dawn of civilization, the mythology of our past, and the pseudoscience of our future are all blended to create a world that is a pleasure to explore and understand. It's up to you, the player, to uncover and understand what's going on within these ruins. And the game doesn't hold your hand through any of it, for better or for worse. I say this because the developers of La-Mulana are deranged sociopaths, a generation who grew up on MSX titles like The Maze of Gallius and sought to recreate this genre. Everything from the level design, puzzles and boss battles all share the same goal: put brutal and mind-bending barriers in front of the player and force them to overcome them, with an aesthetic, music and core gameplay look to match the era that inspired it. La-Mulana's commitment to its vision is commendable, however this does come at a price. Only 58% of players have even made it into the ruins themselves. To put that into perspective, this bar is so low that by the time I finish this sentence, I've already made it into the ruins. This trend continues with only 20% of the players having beaten the first guardian of the game. These numbers really just demonstrate how crushing this game is to new players who come into it unprepared. But despite this, somehow it managed to get a sequel. In 2014, La-Mulana 2 was announced. While I was excited for its success, I never committed to actually playing the game when it finally released back in 2018. I had already finished La-Mulana 1, a grueling 60-hour nightmare of a game. Did I truly want to go through this again? I recently decided to bite the bullet and take the dive again, and I'm glad I did. La-Mulana 2 takes the core strengths of its predecessor and elevates them to new highs, while simultaneously addressing the many important flaws in its predecessor without hindering the core identity of the series.
They wanted to make a truly great and modern sequel.
They would no longer be constrained by design choices for the sake of genre authenticity. So what did they throw out and what did they improve upon? Why is La-Mulana 2 the best sequel ever? Part 1. Why does everyone give up on La-Mulana? This series has two defining gameplay mechanics: arbitrary death and extremely challenging puzzles. Thematically, ancient ruins without death traps just wouldn't make much sense, but the nature of these deaths and the way that they're used between the two games is actually very telling. If you've ever watched a video essay before, then you will know that the Goomba in World 1-1 of Super Mario Bros. Is the single greatest video game innovation, followed closely by placing audio tapes next to skeletons.
I believe in no god.
While it's easy to dismiss Game Theory 101 as pointless, it still provides an important lesson. First impressions matter. They cement the player's understanding of the game and how they should understand the problems they will face. With that in mind, we should go back to the very beginning of the game and see how it utilizes its first impression. At the very start of the game, you're presented with many different directions to explore. If you proceed to the left, you'll reach the hot springs, and then eventually a sign telling you not to go any further, stating there is danger ahead. The next screen is a boss that you can't pass until you have a certain item you'll find later in the game. If you decide to climb up the mountain, you will eventually reach a waterfall, and a sign telling you not to go any further because there is danger ahead. This might as well be the river Styx because once you cross this point, there is no escape. Your options from here on out are get torn apart by birds as you fail to escape, or jump into the lake, drowning yourself to escape the fresh hell that is existence. So a game that initially presents itself as open is in actual fact completely linear, with the only options being the intended route, a dead end, and a dead end that kills you very slowly. In spite of these setbacks, you're an aspiring member of the 20% club. Unlike the lesser specimens that dare call themselves human, you have the intellect and cunning required to enjoy this masterpiece. So you grit your teeth, head towards the gate of guidance, the only option that will actually allow you to advance. However, even knowing the correct way, if you leave the village without both the hand scanner and text translation software, you won't be able to read any of the signage in the game. Not to mention the software you need to read maps, which in a game where geography and location are so important, is kind of critical. So it's near guaranteed you will be forced to explore the ruins without at least one of these items, and you will inevitably return to the village multiple times in order to buy them. This results in a lot of backtracking in the initial hours of your playthrough. Heavens forbid if you go further afield to the spring in the sky, only to be faced with another dead end, which you will have to backtrack through the entire way from. You're probably sitting there thinking, this game sounds miserable, and for a lot of players it is, hence why so few players continue to play past this point. If there's any lessons a first time player will learn during this initial hour, they are: La-Mulana will waste your time for exploring the wrong places, La-Mulana will punish you harshly for not listening to its warnings and waste your time, and worst of all, La-Mulana will waste your time even if you do everything correctly. But what if there was an item that let you freely teleport between these very save points at any time you like, saving you from the extended backtracking and also certain death in a pinch? Better yet, what if this item was actually in the Gate of Guidance? The reason I say this is because the Holy Grail, the item that does exactly this, is in the Gate of Guidance. But where is it exactly? The Holy Grail is located in this room, inside this chest. Taking a casual look around, there's no obvious mechanisms to open it, so you go looking around for clues. On the opposite end of this corridor, you examine a skeleton which left a note stating that they found a secret passage. You whip around searching for force walls or anything suspicious and you find nothing. So you decide to finish the puzzle in this room and still nothing. It just leads to an unrelated room. So you might be wondering, what is the answer to this puzzle? Is there a tablet that gives me the solution that I haven't read? Is there an NPC I need to talk to who opens the way? Well, the answer? If you've read the instruction manual included with the game, you find out that La-Mulana's level structure actually represents a 4x5 grid, that the fields each fold into each other in a 3-dimensional space. If you factor that together with the skeleton's clue, then the solution is obvious. An invisible corridor behind the skeleton that leads back into the room with the chest, at the opposite end of this hallway.
Three-dimensional object has not been perfectly represented in its projection in 2 dimensions.
One of the very first puzzles in the game which protects one of the best items in the game from a quality of life standpoint is an invisible corridor puzzle that requires you to have a fundamental understanding of the world design. World design you're only told through an external manual. As you may have guessed, many people did not figure this out. If this player drop off here is represented by "I hate this bird and this jumping sucks ass," then this drop off can be best called "people who didn't find the Holy Grail." Had this simply been the worst first impression by an otherwise good game, I could have easily overlooked this. Unfortunately, it's a trend that's representative of the game at its absolute worst. A later section in the Inferno Cavern is a prime example of this. The challenge starts at this platform section, made especially difficult thanks to the extremely jank controls and the irregularity of your jump arc. This by itself isn't a major concern, but this section is then immediately followed by a difficult boss fight, which you will highly likely be ill-equipped to face. I couldn't get footage of him, but just pretend he's here and that he's really scary. Assuming you eventually beat this boss, the next room is a puzzle that you can only attempt once. Failing prevents you from reaching the reward, forcing you to either restart your game and go through the entire process all over again, or give up on the item entirely. Also, don't forget that this puzzle can instantly kill you. The ultimate issue at play here is that the challenge doesn't stem from any of these component parts, but the endurance run nature of it all, and the way it punishes failure so harshly. There isn't a lesson to be learned or a skill to be mastered from all this backtracking you're forced to do. In other words, it's a waste of time. This criticism seems to be one of the main concerns that Neguro looked at to address in La-Mulana 2. We can directly contrast its opening with the previous game. The game immediately opens, but instead of being placed directly in the village, this time you have to break these pots before entering. Once you do, Zelpud is there, and says basically the same thing as he did in the first game. If you explore to the left this time, you meet one of the main characters, and he gives you some of that lore. Climbing up the mountain still leads to a dead end, but it's much quicker this time around. And because it's caused by wreckage, you figure you'll come back to this area later. You can then try to enter the ruins, but as you approach, Nebber asks to make sure that you have the hand scanner and the software. You also have enough gold to afford them both from the pots you were forced to break at the very beginning. Next you enter the ruins for more tutorialization. The game demonstrates how treasure chests can be opened in a variety of ways. Just straight up gives you the Holy Grail before you reach the second save point, has an optional side area for added lore, an introductory boss fight, and you're introduced to Phobos, who will be your primary guide throughout the game, and will consistently give you useful hints. Unlike Zelpud, who is basically useless the entire game. All of this is done within the first few minutes of gameplay, and before you've even reached Eglana proper. While the Gates of Guidance are, in my opinion, an unfortunate failure of a tutorial level, the roots of Yggdrasil more than make up for it and prove they've learned from these mistakes. Each of the individual screens acts as a lesson in a specific La-Mulana mechanic. This pressure plate here opens this chest. Climbing this ladder, I got stuck. Actually, breakable wall. Wait here, chest opened this air. Oh, look at that pot. I will break that open. What's this? Another breakable wall? Reinforcing an earlier received lesson to demonstrate its importance? Why, I never! All of this within a relatively safe, linear environment before the ruins quickly open up after you reach this save point. Following this is the game's first real puzzle. And with this first puzzle comes the first lethal trap. The difference here is that if you die here, you immediately spawn back in the adjacent room. Wow, convenient. Yes, La-Mulana 2 will still try to arbitrarily kill you in very dumb ways, but if you keep on your toes, you should be able to avoid them. Well, most of them. An excellent example of this is in the Gate of the Dead. When you enter this area, you cannot explore left, as this wall blocks your path. But if you enter this doorway, the gravity is suddenly inverted, this pot falls with the gravity chains, and the world is flipped upside down, hence demonstrating to the player that the gravity change applies to objects and enemies as well. This is an important lesson to know because once you proceed to the very next room, the game utilizes this knowledge to instantly kill you. Eventually, this evolves into a bizarre death trap metagame, with you trying to guess how the developers are trying to kill you in the next room. For example, this fight with this mini-boss has a chandelier of death ominously looming over you the entire time. But you're getting smart to this game's shenanigans, and you know how this is going to end. So you fight this boss with one eye on the death trap the entire time. Eventually you kill the boss, hear this noise, start to see this trap react,
and then immediately run to the right so that when the trap falls, you'll avoid it.
Sure, you can buy 100 shurikens and spend the next 2 minutes throwing them at Nidhogg in order to sequence break the game to get access to the Icefire treetop early, but when you get there, you will more than likely immediately die.
The difference between this and the Inferno Cavern situation
is that the player has to knowingly place themselves into this obviously dangerous situation before they very obviously die. That is the fundamental difference between an open world that is dangerous and having an open world that feels like it's just punishing the player for exploring at all. This, I believe, is one of the critical differences between the two games on a basic design level. La-Mulana 1 will force you through all of this just to challenge a mini-boss. In La-Mulana 2, if a guardian kills you, you will respawn immediately in front of the Ankh so you can try again. La-Mulana 2 sets the default difficulty high, but gives the player a variety of options to tackle a given challenge. For example, gun. The reason why I emphasized this bad first impression so much was because, unbeknownst to me, I had actually finished the first game without a critical item. There's a certain software in the game called the Future Development Company. Without this, you can't even teleport to half of the levels in the game. That means back in 2013 when I first completed the game, I had done so without teleporting to over half of the levels. If this doesn't go to show just how ingrained these bad thoughts can get, I don't know what else does. Part 2. What is common sense?
What is considered to be common sense is often a matter of perspective.
Your culture and individual life experience inevitably impact how you interpret the world. So the greatest crime any puzzle game can do is to presuppose common sense. Using a snake as a rope to climb down the well might seem like a plausible solution according to the developer, but maybe the player wants to use the ladder they found earlier, and it doesn't occur to them that the situation calls for the snake. When players hit these logic barriers, results of this are either the player brute forcing every possible solution, or they simply give up. The La-Mulana series is at its worst when the player is grinding their face against a wall. If the game doesn't do enough to teach its own rule set, then it can hardly fault the player for giving up in frustration, because the goddamn skeleton was leaning against an invisible corridor the whole time. Oftentimes, either the language is too vague, or the game actively expects the player to contradict the lessons it spent time teaching them. The main gimmick of the Temple of Moonlight is that you need to be very careful where and what you whip. Using your weapon at all inside the pyramid will result in you getting zapped, and yet, the best weapon in the game is hidden behind this very wall. There's no hints in the game about this, meaning that the only way you would naturally find it here is with a lucky wall check. The very thing this level has been actively training you to not do. This is 100% snake rope logic. Within the Tower of Ruin, it asks you to identify the seductress. This sounds obvious enough, use the hand scanner. Except this doesn't work. You can try all manner of different ways to inspect them, but nothing you do will work. Whenever you give up on this puzzle and decide to do something else, you will now always have this puzzle in the back of your mind. There's this ever-present fear of being in the wrong place in the wrong time. And in a non-linear puzzle game, set in an expansive, interconnected ruin, when this mentality sets in, it poisons everything. This will almost inevitably result in the player reaching for a guide,
or simply stumbling upon the solution at a later point.
neither of which are satisfying. La-Mulana 1 is basically an extended period of fun and adventure, suddenly crashing to a screeching halt when the game asks you, hey, do you remember that miscellaneous skeleton number 18 said about the god Isis 20 hours ago? Because if you don't, good luck making any progress, and if you don't remember where he is, good luck finding him.
La-Mulana 1 even expected the player to have a notepad at their side, and that they would physically write down the notes that they were taking.
This game really expects a lot from the player that it doesn't explain. In order to think outside the box, you have to first know what's inside the box. Thankfully, La-Mulana 2 has clever solutions to help mitigate these problems. I mentioned earlier that Phobos acts as your primary guide, and while this is true, you also have Zelplud,
Samaranta and Mulbert
all regularly messaging you with contextual hints, almost immediately. Plus you can easily visit them if you get stuck or want more specific hints. So to compare and contrast, we've gone from a single hint giver, who helps with absolutely none of the major puzzles in the game, and compare that to all of this. On top of this, hints found in the ruin often have pictograms and illustrations alongside the text information to give greater context. Instead of everyone being anonymous robe skeletons, now each NPC is a unique mythological figure. This is a simple change that dramatically improves the game. It deepens the lore by giving you the perspectives of current and historical events directly from the people inhabiting the world.
It makes these NPCs immediately recognisable, and thus making their place in the world a lot easier to understand.
Contrasted to skeleton number 13. This is all without even mentioning the glossary that tracks every creature and character you meet, the journal entries of Lameza and Sean, brand new additional software including a race scanner that determines the race and tribe of the author of a given tablet, so that you now know who is giving you the information, and that might change how you need to apply it or interpret it.
Greetings. I trust you are serving the guild well. I've not always been happy with the standards of conduct in here, but our new King's reforms are quite encouraging.
Thanks to these improvements, I was able to solve every puzzle in La-Mulana 2 using only the in-game tracker and a few screenshots. All of this added information and context allows La-Mulana 2 to have puzzles that are much more complicated and difficult in theory, but by virtue of the amount of information you're provided with, you're much more likely to be readily available to solve these puzzles. Even the location of these hints are extremely well considered, such as this area in Divine Fortress. There are a multitude of different important locations and puzzles hints all localized in this small area that you will be coming back to often. So no matter which of these puzzles you came here to solve or tablets you came here to read, you will always walk past these other hints and be reminded of their relevance. Perhaps they're unsolvable now, but maybe not in a few hours. This is a trick very often pulled by this game that is completely absent from La-Mulana 1. This is used both to foreshadow puzzles you will eventually solve much later, while placing them in a context where the player can naturally intuit that these puzzles aren't immediately solvable. All of these changes added together means less confusion, less pointless wandering, and more places to turn if you've truly hit a brick wall and don't know what to do anymore. The game even has certain hints sent directly to the player if they try to brute force certain puzzles, or spend too long in a certain location without making progress.
With all this added context given to the world, how are the actual puzzles themselves? This section will contain a spoiler for a moderately challenging mid-late game puzzle, so if you do plan on playing this game, I'd skip ahead of this section. I've got the time code on screen, so you can skip ahead now. Alright, with that out of the way, in Heaven's Labyrinth, there is no way to access this chest once you've opened it, so you need to figure out how to enter this room from this entrance. However, the entrance doesn't exist in this area, and that must mean you must come from an entirely different field. The only thing that makes this room stand out is the twin statues of the Snake People, and the home of the coveted Lamia GF is the Takamagahara Shrine. In this room, a tablet asks, "Where is this?" This question can be interpreted in two ways, either figuratively, as a statement of confusion and being out of place, or taken literally as a question about the location you are occupying. If you interpret it figuratively, combine that with the knowledge that it is a third child giving you this information, then it's reasonable to deduce that these two areas are connected somehow. The question then is, how are they connected? If we follow this figurative line of reasoning, we will hit a roadblock here, but perhaps the answer lies elsewhere. Within one of the last areas of the game, a tablet explicitly refers to the connection here, the Infernal Beast being the Heaven's Labyrinth, and the Colossal Dragon being the Takamagahara Shrine. It then also outright gives you the mantra password that you need to incant in this room in order to open the passageway. So that's a fairly standard La-Mulana puzzle. But what about that question again? Where is this? What if we take this literally and try to solve this puzzle in that way? Well, where is this? What is the Takamagahara Shrine? According to Shinto beliefs, Takamagahara is the heavenly abode of the Koto Matsukami, created from the separation of the divine and earthly elements, which are connected via a bridge. So how would I explain this to an Olympian third child, in a way that they would understand? We can try the mantra heaven and earth, but that'll fail. That would have been too easy anyway, 2-word passwords aren't exactly the most secure. Well, how did ancient Greek understand creation? They considered the cosmos to be composed of the 4 primordial elements: earth, wind, fire, and water. Coincidentally, the exact same 4 earthly elements as those in Japanese Shintoism. So these combined with the 5th heavenly element would surely be the meeting point between these two, and this admittedly is a bit of a stretch of a connection to make on its own, but it's still clearly intentional. The beauty of this puzzle is that as you naturally progress through the game, you will get more and more explicit hints about the connection between these two areas and start getting you thinking along these lines. And even if you don't have any idea of the mythological connotations of the Takamagahara Shrine, you can still find the answer here. So figuring this puzzle out either way is just as valid.
Altogether, these changes total up to an adventure that, while still extremely dangerous, gives the player much better orientation about how they should go about exploring the ruins. However, this section mostly covered how La-Mulana 2 fixed the issues that La-Mulana 1 created. What about the ways in which La-Mulana 2 elevates the series into something truly special? Part 3. What is archaeology? The real meat of these games is the way that it ties all its disparate mechanics together. In La-Mulana 1, it features a loose connection of worlds with fairly generic titles: Gates of Guidance, Spring in the Sky, Infernal Cavern, etc., which are connected primarily by the game's story, and then have an additional layer of mythology layered on top. It is very evident that La-Mulana 1, the story of the runes and the design of the puzzles, took precedence over fleshing out these mythological themes. They're still there, just less so. Exploring and uncovering these mysteries is still satisfying, and there's nothing wrong with this design, of course. La-Mulana 2 takes these interesting concepts and fully integrates them into both the narrative and the game design as a whole. There's a juggling act at play here between the overarching narrative of Ragnarok, which is the central Nordic theming of the game, the respective mythologies of each of the individual locations, and the ways in which these mythos interact with one another via the creative choices Nigoro choose to make. Almost every single area in La-Mulana 2 is directly inspired by a specific mythology, or combination of mythologies, and yet despite each area being unique, it somehow manages to bring them all together. It's a living, breathing world that's chock full of references far more intelligent than an Indiana Jones knockoff has any right to be. I've now covered my main points I'd like to make, and I would strongly urge you to at least give these games a try. If you plan on playing La-Mulana 1 first, read the manual. But for those of you who need more convincing, I'm going to enter spoiler territory. This will be for the identity of and the backstory to the 4th Guardian of the game, so I'm not going to spoil anything related to puzzles or gameplay, but if you would rather keep yourself completely spoiler free when you play the game, now is the time to bail. This section also contains a Scottish man pronouncing many Egyptian names, places and concepts, so when I inevitably screw this up, know in advance that I am sorry. In La-Mulana 2, you enter the Gate of the Dead, home of the Aenad, led by Horus and Atum. You hear of Ra and the Armana, a rogue sect who are attempting to reach divinity. Within the world of La-Mulana, the caricatures of ancient gods are in fact derived from various people of the ruins wearing ceremonial garb, at least in most cases. Through a process known as chimerification, Ra has found a way to make himself more powerful, by combining himself with other animals and eventually other deities. By the time you finally track down Ra, it's already too late. He has already cannibalized both Ammon and Horus, in order to become strong enough to fuse with an ancient superweapon called Aten, said to give him the true power of God, the ability to create life itself, represented in the boss fight by these little grabby hands that come down and drop dung beetles everywhere. So why did I explain all this? You're likely aware of Ra and Horus on a basic level, but this story demonstrates some remarkable ability on the part of Nigoro
to seamlessly bring their own world canon
and incorporate it with both ancient mythology and history. Why is that, you might ask? So let's get back to that superweapon, Aten. What is Aten? A representation of the sun with its arms outstretched. According to modern historians, Aten was considered a minor deity of ancient Egyptian mythology, and it appears as though Aten wasn't viewed with much mainstream importance. That was until 14th century BC, when Atenism was formally founded by the pharaoh Akhenaten. In this time, the pharaohs of Egypt were often considered walking manifestations of the gods they declared for. But Akhenaten was notorious for decreeing that Aten wasn't just the god whom he favoured, but the only god deserving of worship. Due to the contentious nature of this time period, it's hard to make firm declarative statements, but it is believed by many that Akhenaten viewed himself as an embodiment of Ra, who he considered to be an aspect of Aten. There was no distinction to be made between Aten, Ra, and himself. He may have viewed the polytheism of his contemporaries with either suspicion or disdain. Regardless, he restricted, or some claim outright banned, the worship of these other gods, all save for Aten, with himself as the living embodiment of its power. After his reign, Akhenaten's history was eventually destroyed by those who came after, who viewed his shunning of the other gods and the forbidding of their worship as criminal. The question is then, how do we know that such a controversial figure existed thousands of years ago, especially if there was an active attempt by those recording history to erase his name? This is because during his time, he founded a new city in order to dedicate himself and his people to the worship of their singular all-powerful god, likely also to serve as a logistical barrier between himself, his people, and the temples of the gods they had previously followed. But as with any usurpation of power, when Akhenaten's reign ended, his city was abandoned shortly thereafter, leaving its ruins undisturbed, containing a wealth of history for centuries, only to be rediscovered by French and British imperialists who proceeded to yoink everything in sight. The Europeans who plundered these ruins realized they may have discovered one of the first recorded monotheistic religions in history. Some 20th century academics, such as Sigmund Freud, even suggested that this may have been a precursor religion to the Abrahamic faiths. So what is the name given to this ancient city dedicated to the worship of Aten? Armana, and the worship of Aten was later referred to as the Armana heresy. There's more to it than that, like how Ra's chimerification is actually represented within Egyptian mythology itself, with the interplay of the gods commonly being depicted as having their forms combined. But if we went into detail about every little thing, I would be here all day. To quickly recap, in La-Mulana 2, a game about a Japanese-American, blonde-haired cowgirl archaeologist with ninja training who accidentally starts Ragnarok, utilizes iconography and mythology of ancient Egypt and ties it allegorically to the life of a pharaoh who deified himself using the very same mythology. It does this in order to relate the history of the conflict between the centralizing power of monotheism under a single ambitious ruler versus the diffuse power structures inherent to polytheistic societies, and the aristocratic priest classes they represent, a trend recurring throughout history time and time again. This is just a small portion of the kind of storytelling built into La-Mulana 2. How these very distinct but elaborate codependent story elements are weaved together is the foundation on which the entire game is built upon. The best part, in my view, is that despite me describing all this history out to you in laborious detail, you don't actually need to know any of what I said. When I said my spoiler warning that nothing I said relates to the puzzles or gameplay, I meant it. In fact, I only made this realization as I was writing the script for this very video. I did more research into the subject matter and confirmed my suspicions. It gives you the freedom to enjoy the game purely for its own sake, but if you do decide to dive into the artistic choices made within the game, you'll find a story worth discovering. Why are the halls of Valhalla populated with the heroes and deities of Hindu legend? Who are the mysterious Anunnaki and what do they have to do with Sumerian culture? Is Typhon, monster serpent of Greek legend who challenged Zeus for the control of the heavens, actually a Google Stadia? If you stay along for the ride, La-Mulana will answer all of these questions and more. History can be both the jailer and emancipator of peoples long deceased. It can validate the struggles of the previously unheard, and it can condemn the petty tyrants who corrupt reality with their poisonous influence. But it also can lay bare the unfortunate reality that history is written by the winners. But this is also what makes learning about history and culture so interesting and continually relevant. You're always gaining a new perspective on history if you're open to new ideas. It takes institutions and people to approach these forgotten truths with a critical yet empirical mindset to do the hard work of understanding the voices of the past.
Ask and you shall be given, think and you shall find. These videos of mine have always been a passion project, and which I've always tried to fit into my life whenever I could. Unfortunately, as you can tell by my upload schedule, that isn't exactly particularly often. This is simply because I don't have this financial security to dedicate myself to this channel. So I set up this Patreon page with the goal of hopefully being able to spend more time working on videos instead of wage slaving. I recently became unemployed, hence why I was able to spend a month making this video, but unfortunately I won't have the time to keep making videos unless I'm able to generate more income. Obviously there's 100,000 different charities that you could donate to or support. I mean, we are in the middle of a pandemic. But if you would like to support me specifically, then I put some links in the description there.